If you haven't heard of the Playdate, it's this tiny yellow handheld retro console that features a crank on the side made by Panic. Seeing this unique system got me immediately interested in making a game for it. Lucky for me, even though I'm still waiting by the door for my system to arrive, Panic released the SDK along with the simulator that you can run on your computer to test and build your own games. So after a bit of time reading over the documentation and watching a couple videos on how the Playdate works, I jumped straight into making a game. The basic idea that I had was for an action arcade game where you have a shield to reflect incoming projectiles into each other to score points, while you pick up power-ups and last as long as possible. After first getting some basic player movement down with a placeholder character, was working on the shield. That involved making the angle of the shield rotate when the crank is turned, having it move 360 degrees around the player. Getting the projectiles and collisions working was trickier than the other steps so far. There was definitely a learning curve with understanding how the Playdate handles collisions, and that took a little bit to figure out. First off is the fact that the SDK only allows for static box colliders, so figuring out how to have collisions between two curved objects presented a problem. You can see the pink lines representing the collision box that, as the reflector rotates around the collider, moves, but doesn't rotate with the shield. To fix this, I just made it so that the collider is much larger than it needed to be, so the reflector always stays inside as it rotates. To handle the curved collisions, I only make sure to trigger a collision when a solid pixel is overlapping inside that collider. After many, and I mean many, failed attempts, even having to go back to my high school math to break out the unit circle, I finally got it working right. Sort of. I mean, there were still a couple of edge cases where the collision would go in the opposite direction and cause the player to get hit, but instead of fixing that, I was pretty tired of math, so I decided to push it off to my future self. That aside, I put in some walls and added an alert so that the player knows where the next projectile will be coming into the screen from. I was really tired of looking at the game with its random placeholder art at this point, and so I took some time to add in some new player sprites, some UI elements, and I also created a particle system to help give the projectiles some impact after being reflected.
Wow!
After finishing a system for saving player high scores and displaying them on the game over screen, basically everything was done for the bare bones gameplay. I still felt like it was lacking a bit though, so I decided to add in a power-up system, where there are 3 different types of power-ups: speed, a score multiplier, and a shield extender that will randomly appear during the game that you can collect to temporarily gain those buffs. I think not only did it help add in some extra gameplay elements, but it helped incentivize the player to move around and not just sit still and wait for the projectiles to come to them. At this point, I was happy with the endless mode, but I wanted there to be another way to play the game. I had the idea for a challenge mode that would be a bunch of unique changes to the way you play the game with set scores you need to reach in order to gain stars in each challenge. I was inspired by games like Super Smash Bros., where they have these modes that are way different from the main gameplay, and they're a fun side activity for you to mess around with. So, for example, there's a challenge where you couldn't move, another where you have no reflector, and since I was inspired by Smash, there was a target smash challenge I added. I got selection menus and game over menus working, and I ended up putting in 7 different challenges. With the challenge mode complete, I still wanted some more variety in the gameplay, so a new mode called Target Rush was made. This would be completely different than any other type of game mode, so it deserved its own mode instead of just being another challenge. My idea for this was to have the player locked to the left side of the screen, and 3 columns of targets spawn in on the right. Periodically, the player would shoot out a projectile that destroys the targets. The further away the column is, the slower it spawns targets, but the more likely they are to be more valuable. Now, the game was starting to wrap up, and I had a deadline to release it in the coming weeks, since I partnered up with 12 other great Playdate devs to create a community bundle. That was fine though, since I was pretty much done at this point. I just wanted to polish up a couple more things and send the game to some playtesters just to make sure everything was working right. So, after sending it to the first playtester, I was a bit nervous for feedback they'd give on the game, but I'm sure they'll... Oh, that is not good. So if you couldn't tell by looking at it, the Playdate isn't over here running with a Ryzen 9 12-core processor, but the simulator doesn't actually account for that. Since it's running off the computer, it can seem like everything is running just fine, while in fact the system is chugging at like 5 FPS. Since I don't have my system yet, I had never been able to test this on an actual device, and I had no clue that something was wrong. That being said, I did know what was the more intensive part of the gameplay, and so it shouldn't be that awful trying to find this issue and fix it.
3 weeks later.
Yeah, so that was the most frustrating 3 weeks of programming I've ever had. I was basically playing blind whack-a-mole since I couldn't test any of the changes that I made when I did, but I had to guess on the problem and send it to someone else with a bunch of changes and hope it was magically fixed this time. This went on for weeks, and with marginal improvement over that time. That was until someone who tried it on the Playdate developer forum noticed that when they toggled off the music, it ran smoothly on the device. All of those weeks boiled down to me needing to switch the option of the audio output from MP3 to 80 PCM. That was it, the whole problem. That change alone increased the performance by about 20 FPS. Now, some may say that this was something that's noted in the docs and I should have found this sooner, but I had no idea it would make this big of a difference. So I'm glad I found it, and thank you to the person who noticed that. And with that aside, there wasn't a lot of time left with the deadline approaching, and there's still everything I needed to do 3 weeks prior, but with only 1 week to do it all now. Since there was a build that was actually playable now, the playtesters were able to try it out and give me their feedback, and there's a lot of stuff I learned from that. From that feedback, I added in a stat tracker that you could view in the menu, a tip section to clear up how to play, a health ship in endless mode that you could hit to regain a life, a new menu option for crank sensitivity, and I was able to balance out the difficulty of all the modes and the scores needed for 3 stars in challenges. By far the biggest change though was the target rush mode was not so great overall. You could just angle it all the way down, not move, and it will hit the most targets possible. So most players just ended up doing that, and it wasn't very fun. So I needed to make some changes to how that mode works overall. Now the middle target is actually a multiplier of 0, 1.5, or 2, and that is multiplied by the sum of the targets hit in the first and last column by the same projectile. This added a lot more decision making and tense moments if you almost hit that times 0 multiplier. And with that change, the game was finished. And there were still a couple of edge cases where the collision would go in the opposite direction and cause the player to get hit, but instead of fixing that, I was pretty tired of math, so I decided to push it off to my future self. Shoot, I still have to fix those broken collisions. After a couple days of debugging, I finally figured out what was causing that weird collision edge case though, and now, just a couple days before the deadline, the game was now complete. I'm really proud of how it turned out, and I definitely learned some things from this project. Most importantly, get your game to playtesters early. You don't want to wait around until the last minute if major changes are needed. Even with just a minimal amount of testing done on my game, it made it way better, so that's definitely something I'm taking with me into other projects. So yeah, what I thought was going to be a quick little experiment ended up turning into a couple month long project that ended in me actually releasing my first commercial game. It's out now on itch, and there's a link in the description so you can check that out if you're interested. In the future, I am hoping to add in some extra challenges, so that may be coming at some point. But yeah, that's about it, so thank you for watching.